Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. If I may, allow me to ask you a brief question. What does Thomas the Tank Engine mean to you? Now, to most of you, you're probably scratching your heads thinking why on earth I'd be interested in your opinion of a baby show you hadn't thought about since you were 5. However, allow me to expand your small-minded assessment and dive into the franchise's rich history and the appreciation that so many people have for Thomas, long after they've passed childhood. This weekend, I was honoured to attend an event at the Tanny Railway, which was the inspiration behind Awdry's Skarloey Railway, which celebrated the lore, legacy, and the fans of the beloved Reverend. This is the Awdry Extravaganza. The second one, I didn't make it to the first. Before I jump into my experience that weekend, some background is required. Wilbert Awdry was a passionate railway enthusiast, who, as well as using his railway knowledge for 9 fantastic children's books, also spent time volunteering on heritage railways. One of them was the Tanny Railway in Wales. He loved the railway so much that, for the 10th volume of the railway series, he came up with the Skarloey Railway, which was a railway on Sodor identical to the Tanny with the names of the engines and stations changed. Tanny became Skarloey, Dolgoch became Rheneas, Sir Hayden became Sir Handel, Edward Thomas became Peter Sam, Melander became Rusty, Douglas became Duncan, Tom Rolt became Ivo Hugh, and Alf became Fred. Wilbert also used a lot of his own experiences with the railway to create the stories. For example, Sir Hayden's inappropriate wheels, which weren't fit for the track, causing him to ride roughly on the rails, formed Sir Handel's characterisation as a rough rider who cared little for his trains. Another example would be Peter Sam and the Refreshment Lady, in which Peter Sam foolishly leaves the Refreshment Lady behind at Skarloey Station. However, in reality, it had been Wilbert who, while working as a guard, had accidentally left the Refreshment Lady behind. Awdry's love for his new railway and its history would lead to a further 4 books published, further expanding the line and its connection to the Tanny As a result of Awdry being a valued member of the line's community and the exposure brought to the railway by the Skarloey books, the Tanny proudly celebrates the railway series and its legacy, even keeping Wilbert's study in their narrow gauge railway museum. And the railway welcomes fans of the series with open arms. And now that we've finished with the basics, allow me to tell you my experience at the Awdry Extravaganza. Now, the very first activity occurred on the Friday prior to the weekend. The railway's number 9, Alf, now dressed up to look like her railway series counterpart Fred, ran the first train she'd ever done in her railway series makeover. In fact, all of the Tanny fleet had been modified to resemble the characters from the railway series. Unfortunately, I was travelling to Wales on that day, so I missed Fred's debut train, and I couldn't go any sooner because I had school. That pesky education. However, I arrived late that evening and was ready for what the weekend had in store. The first of the many activities I attended was the Awdry exhibition, with a slot at 9 AM. This was a fascinating insight into the Reverend as well as so many of his creations. On display were his own personal models he'd built for many of his characters, handwritten letters to fans of the series, including one in which he really goes off on Dalby and blames him for indignant letters from children like your Christopher. Man, Awdry was a legend. Artwork from the railway series, props from the TV series, Awdry's notes, timetables and manuscripts, and so much more. All while the original music from the TV series by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell played in the background. In fact, there was so much on show that to describe it all would take the majority of this video, so instead, I'll just show it to all of you. I'll return after this slideshow. Pretty amazing, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg that was this weekend. If you'd asked me a week ago who my favourite narrow gauge engine was, I'd have said Duke. However, now I'd answer Rusty, and shortly I'll explain why. After my time at the exhibition had ran out, I spent some time exploring Tywin Wharf Station. While this portion of the day was rather uneventful, if I had the choice to be anywhere during that time, I wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else. Part of the fun of the weekend was getting to watch the trains come in and leave the station, and getting to see so many of the Skarloey engines up close, such as Peter Sam, Rusty, Duncan, Ivo Hugh, and Fred. But, by far the most amazing part of these few hours was getting to meet so many fellow Thomas fans and see so much of their talent up close.
Hello, what's up Master Builders? I'm Jindy Briggs Railway, and this is like, I'm with this awesome guy at the moment, and he's always interested in my Lego trains. Of course, this is like, almost got the whole crew, apart from Duncan, who popped out just 2 seconds ago. But yeah, apart from that though, it's just like, yes, all this are literally 100% Lego. I made them myself. And of course, I already mentioned who I am, so if you want to check out my YouTube channel or Twitter account, go ahead.
One of the activities was being allowed to drive Rusty from the wharf to Pendry, and once my time arrived, I was thrilled, but also slightly nervous. I'd never driven an engine before, and I'd have a lot to explain to the rest of the fandom if I ended up as the guy who crashed Rusty, even though a teenager crashing Rusty at a fan event would no doubt inspire some very good stories. However, the driver who supervised everyone was amazing. His explanations of what to do were easy to follow and not overly complicated, and he made the idea of driving an engine come off as easy as pie. And so off I drove, confident that the little diesel would return in one piece. And indeed he did. And honestly, this was the highlight of my day. Getting to drive Rusty was so much fun, especially when I was allowed to increase Rusty's speed to the maximum and speed along the Tallyclin Railway. I'd never felt more alive than I had in that moment in Rusty's small cap. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Rusty's my favourite narrow gauge engine. True, he's hardly the most interesting of the bunch, however, he was the first locomotive I ever drove, and you never forget your first. Definitely the most anticipated part of the day was the picnic. A train based off the picnic train Duke pulled on the mid-SODOR line. To immerse us all, Peter Sam's nameplate was replaced with the original name he carried on the mid-SODOR, which was Stuart. And every time we stopped at a station, the organiser, Luke Ryan, would shout out the name of the Skarloey Railway's counterpart, as opposed to the actual name of the station. We all climbed aboard Stuart's coaches, and off we puffed. But we had to stop a few times to let Duncan and Ivo Hugh pass, which slightly broke the illusion as neither of them had been built when the mid-SODOR was open, but they were both splendid sights when they passed. And then we were off again. Once we arrived at Skarloey Station, we were treated to an afternoon tea, which included sandwiches, scones, sausage rolls, and crisps. It was indeed the perfect British meal. Just to clarify, the fudge wasn't included, it's just a rule that I buy fudge every time I go on holiday, because what's a trip out worth if you don't bring fudge home, eh? However, we had little time to consume our food, because we were soon ushered back on for the return journey. Once we returned to Crovan's Gate, the atmosphere was buzzing. By now, the only people remaining at the station were the fans who were waiting to attend Tim Dunn's lecture on the history of SODOR later that day. Most of the general public had gone home. After making friends with a giant seagull, Stuart returned home as well. Now, I don't have any footage of the events I'm about to describe, but you'll have to take my word for it. I'm sure footage exists on Twitter from the other fans present. After Stuart had left, I went to the other side of the station, desperately looking for a quiet part of the line where I could fart. Unfortunately, the only part that was quiet was where Fred was stationed, so I'm taking this opportunity to publicly apologise to Fred for what I subjected him to that afternoon. As I went back to wash down my afternoon tea with half a pint of beer like a true British man, I came across a table where a fan was showing off his model collection, and every time he pulled a new one out, the fans around him reacted as if it were a football match and their team had just scored. And it was brilliant. Again, the highlight of this weekend was getting to see the fandom really come together, and nowhere was that more apparent than here. Because, to be honest, I've never understood the excitement around football. It's a bunch of people running around kicking a ball about. It's presumably fun to take part in, but to watch? No. However, this was absolutely worth the hype. Seeing everyone cheer for the creativity, work and passion of their fellow fans was incredible to witness. I'm just disappointed that the crowd was so large I couldn't get a glimpse of the models that were causing such celebration. But by now it was getting late. The sun was setting, the booking office had closed, and there were fewer people at the station. Surely that meant the day was finished. No, it certainly wasn't. The final event of the day was Tim Dunn's lecture on SODOR's history. Fred and Duncan shuttled us to a church hall where we watched Tim Dunn, a TV presenter behind the architecture that railways built, deliver a fantastic lecture on SODOR's history. So much was revealed in the lecture. For example, it turns out that Edward was originally shipped from the Furness Railway to SODOR, who didn't care enough about him to charge that much. The Coldie Fell was envisioned by the mid-SODOR, and the first Fat Controller was able to arrange Henry's miracle rebuild, as engineer William Stanier owed him a favour, as Topham had helped cover up his scandalous affair. Tim Dunn's sense of humour also made the lecture really entertaining. Him reading Awdry's bizarre description of the first coffee pot engine, followed by his frustrated delivery of the description concluding with, "as seen there," despite no image of the first coffee pot surviving. Other highlights were his disappointment at Tim not being known as one of the mid-SODOR's best engines, his positive descriptions of Thomas, Edward and Gordon's origins before sighing and saying, "and then Henry," his accidental break of character when he slipped up and called Sir Handel Sir Hayden despite having spent the rest of the lecture talking about SODOR as if it were real, and his constant quips about gin and tonic getting him through the day. Also between the two halves of the lecture was an auction, in which a map of SODOR, a first edition copy of Oliver the Western Engine, and the Railway Series Surprise Pack were being sold, all in mint condition. Despite my attempts to obtain the latter two items, I was unfortunately defeated. Since I already owned a copy of Oliver the Western Engine and all I do with the first edition was probably keep it in a drawer, I wasn't willing to pay too much for that. However, the surprise pack, that was mine. And this is where it became apparent to me that I should never gamble lest I develop a crippling addiction, because I kept that bid going as long as I could, until my mother literally forced my hand down. Because, in the adrenaline-fueled high that was that auction, money was just a number, and all I had to do to get that pack was shout a bigger one. Just to be clear, kids, don't do that. You need to be careful with finances, and I clearly have a problem. Once the lecture was over, I approached Tim Dunn to talk to him afterwards, and he was a legend. He was really friendly and easy to talk to. I really hope he comes back next year if the event returns. I also met Veronica Chambers, Wilbert's oldest daughter, who was delightful. She was very appreciative and warm towards the fans of her father's work, and was clearly touched by the enjoyment people were still getting from the books. She also revealed in a Q&A that she and her siblings were indirectly responsible for Awdry figuring out the geography of Sodor, as they were unconvinced that Thomas and Bertie's race was fair until Awdry mapped out the island to prove otherwise. Unfortunately, the shuttle didn't take us back to the station, so we had to make do with our ancient methods of transportation, known as our legs. I went to bed that night excited for what Sunday would bring. On the subject of which, the following day, the atmosphere was much quieter. A lot of the initial excitement had died down, and with less events on throughout the day, everyone spent their free time socialising with other fans. The first thing I did on Sunday was drive Duncan. Now, Duncan had originally been set to be driven throughout the entire weekend. However, as Sir Handel had broken down, Duncan was required to pull trains on Saturday, so Rusty had to fill in. But today, Sir Handel was back, which meant that Duncan was free to be driven. With Duncan, I was much more nervous than I was with Rusty, because I figured that a steam engine would be much more difficult to drive than a diesel. Although Duncan does have a track record of derailing himself due to his carelessness, so if I did crash Duncan, I was planning to just blame it on him. Driving Duncan was a much more stressful experience, but was worth it for the experience itself. I had to pull a lot of levers in very quick succession, and, more than once, the supervising driver had to intervene to make sure Duncan ran smoothly. I also got to blow his whistle at various whistle stops and at animals which were on the line. I was also able to perfect the braking pattern as we came to a stop at Tywin Wharf. It's also worth noting that Duncan's reckless rock and roll style of movement is absolutely factual. He was a very rough rider, and it often felt like you had to hang on for dear life lest you be thrown from the footplate. However, it was so much fun, and I'm happy to finally be able to say that I drove a steam engine. Following on from that, I returned for a second time to the Awdry exhibition, in which I was able to get many more pictures of concept art and behind-the-scenes material I'd neglected in my first visit. With more time this time round, since I'd spent the previous day looking at all the displays, I used a lot of this time to watch Awdry's Farker layout in operation. After that, it was 4 hours until the main event of the day, the photo charter. I spent that time admiring the engines, but mainly I spent that time getting to meet and interact with so many great people. Again, and I can't stress this enough, getting to see us all come together as a fandom to celebrate and interact with each other on such a large scale was the best part of this whole weekend. Some of the people I met include Thomas Theorist, Hazar01, The Lonely Locomotive, Fergus Fan 01, The Blue E2, The Unlucky Tug, Smurfy Dan, just to name a few. Honestly, I don't think I'd ever felt as comfortable in an environment quite like this one for a long time. Getting to talk to so many people that share the same interests and passions as me was a privilege, and one I will remember. It's truly breathtaking to see the talents and camaraderie that a little blue tank engine brings.
I'm the script saying the Scott Louis Theobald is recording. That's it, that's all I have. Well done, mate, that's good.
We are here at the Locomotive Works in Crovansgate, as you can see.
Wait. That's Reginald Payne?
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
The original.
That's unbelievable.
That's original paint drawings.
Wow.
Those are very precious.
Wow, holy shit.
They haven't even got any paint drawings in the exhibition.
Yeah, no. I tried finding one of these. I got like the 10th edition one because I wanted to get Will something for his 18th, but I was duped.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Hold on that one, that is a great one to get.
Yeah.
Hang on.
That's excellent.
Yeah. It was missing a page, but what can you do?
Yeah.
Yeah. But someone had stuck in a page from Tank Engine Thomas again.
So
Yeah.
one random page doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You've reminded me of this absolutely heartbreaking tale of mine, where I went to Buckinghamshire Railway.
Finally, at 4:30 in the afternoon, the final event began. Peter Sam puffed into Tywin Wharf to begin the grand finale, the photo charter. This train involved Peter Sam taking us to key parts of the railway, where several of the illustrations were based, and then parking in the exact location for those illustrations to be replicated by our photographs. The first stop was at Crosney Kerwin, to replicate this illustration from Peter Sam and the Refreshment Lady. Unfortunately, due to the large crowd, it was difficult to get a good view and to make the picture work. Peter Sam had to move, so we only got one shot. However, even if it's not too accurate, I think that I got a really solid photo out of it. The next stop involved us replicating a drawing from Little Old Twins, which looked much better in my opinion. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. Next, we stopped at Renias. See, I got it right that time. Which involved us having to replicate this picture from Gallant Old Engine. I'm quite proud of this one, honestly, because I think I got pretty close, and for such an iconic illustration, I'm proud to have done it justice in my own head. Next, we travelled to Renias Viaduct to try and capture the drawing of Duncan defiantly parking there in Passengers and Polish. This one took a few attempts, many being shockingly terrible, but eventually I got a photo that looked good enough in comparison to the original picture. As Peter Sam turned around, it was time to copy this illustration, also from Peter Sam and the Refreshment Lady. However, this one was nowhere near. Peter Sam was too close, there weren't enough of the coaches in frame, it was a disaster. Then for the iconic illustration of the Refreshment Lady fleeing towards Peter Sam. The angle was all wrong, but it was a lot of fun seeing everyone pretend to be the Refreshment Lady and run at Peter Sam's train, including my mother, who was around a similar age. Following on from that were the final two stops. Peter Sam stopped at the bottom of a hill to reenact this image of Skarloey taking a train in Skarloey Remembers. However, due to an increased amount of trees and bushes, it couldn't be too accurate. However, I still think, when put together, it actually looks quite good. The final stop was back at Crosney Kerwin to replicate the illustration of Sir Handel's return journey in Sir Handel. Unfortunately, not only was the train facing the wrong way, but a giant tree had grown between 1952 and now. Mother Nature's a bitch. So ultimately this one ended up as probably the least accurate of the bunch, and was hardly even a good photo thanks to that godforsaken tree. Who needs them? However, I used the opportunity while Peter Sam was parked to get a more accurate representation of the illustration I butchered earlier. And I'm pretty sure I nailed it this time. And that was that. the final event. Honestly, the photo charter was my favourite part of the day. Getting to see all these locations up close and being able to replicate some of my favourite drawings growing up was an absolute honour. And I only hope that I would have done C. Reginald Dalby and John T. Kenny proud with my photographic recreations of their wonderful illustrations. It was truly a high note to leave the weekend on, and I'm so happy I was able to get tickets for it. Honestly, this weekend were two of the best days of my life. It was so amazing to be able to recapture my childhood by seeing Thomas's roots, and the crew at the Tallyclin did a fantastic job making you feel like you really were on the island of Sodor. Getting to drive not only locomotives, but characters that have been such a huge part of my life for as long as I can remember was a privilege. Ours was being able to recreate the original drawings from the books that I had read so religiously back in my childhood and still now. But definitely, the most rewarding part of this weekend was the friends I made along the way. Everyone I met those couple of days was so friendly and eager to celebrate each other's talents, be it modelling, filmmaking or collecting. We were all united by Thomas and Friends, and people say that it's just for kids.
Well, I'm Adam, aka Thomas Theorist. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be with my good friend Will. We're here at the Tallyclin Railway.
And how have you been enjoying the Awdry Extravaganza so far?
Well, I've been loving it. I've been going up and down the line of the channels. It's my first time being here, so it's great.
And what would you say appeals to adults with Thomas?
Well, I don't know. There's always something very novel about a train with a face. It's very difficult to say, really.
My name's Alex.
And why do you think that Thomas has such a appeal to adults, even after people should supposedly grow out of it?
The characters, I think, have a very timeless quality to them. The stories are very well written. The TV series was also beautifully made, the originals, of course. Yeah, I have a feeling it's just, just through the sheer love and commitment by those involved with it, that it just translates to the people who read and watch it and enjoy it.
In all honesty, a lot of it comes down to the evolution of the characters. The way the books were actually originally written, you start by following characters who are very basic and able to have children brought to them. The bit further you move through the stories, the aspect of it being a children's story is still there, but the attitudes of characters, the evolution, the growth, follows through with people through their life.
So, how have you been finding the Awdry Extravaganza?
How do I define it?
Yeah, how have you been enjoying it?
It's been like really fun. I don't know how to describe it, because I've been meeting so many new faces and making new friends today. It's been a really satisfying experience, I think.
So,
I'm going to sleep very well tonight because it's just been so much.
And what would you say appeals? So you know how most people would think of Thomas as a kid's show.
Yeah.
So how would you say it appeals to adults who have grown up with it over the years and still love it?
Thomas's appeal to adults, I think, comes from its roots. Okay. It's not like some corporate made like kids icon like the Minions or something, where they like just made that to appeal to kids, masses. Thomas has a history like with a man that very was inspired by trains, loved the history of it, and he just applied it to this series, and it shows through in every way. And I think that's why adults like it, because there's just so much to invest yourself in, really. Yeah.